Hi, welcome to Blue Collar Economics. I'm Dr. Brooks Mullen, and today we're going to be talking about disagreements in economics. Specifically, we're going to talk about why economists disagree. Now, the thing is, there is a popular perception that, oh, those economists, they can't agree about anything. You can find an economist to say anything. And while that is kind of true, the reality is that what we do is science. And in science, you don't tend to find universal consensus, particularly science dealing with human behavior. So what we want to do today is talk about the positive reasons, that is the factual reasons that we disagree in economics. We're going to talk about the normative reasons, that is the value-driven reasons that we disagree in economics. And we're going to finish with Gregory Mankiw's famous survey of economists showing you where there actually is economic consensus. So let's begin with the positive reasons that economists disagree. Let's begin with the factual, the objective reasons that economists disagree. Now, the first reason that you can find in a positive sense that economists disagree is that there are certain things that can be broadly true, but not specifically true. And the most famous example of this is the Laffer curve. Now, the Laffer curve is not an actual economic theory. You'll hear it talked about, particularly by a lot of right-wing pundits, but the reality is the Laffer curve was invented by a guy called Arthur Laffer, and he literally drew it on a bar napkin. And what it is it is a bell curve that represents an idea. And that idea is very simple. If on the x-axis we put the tax rate, and on the y-axis, we put tax revenue, you get a bell-shaped curve, or you get some sort of curve function. Now, the problem with that is that it is broadly true. If we have 0% tax rates, then we have zero tax revenue. 0% of any amount of any taxable revenue would be zero. On the other side of the coin, if we have a 100% tax rate, we eliminate all income. Thus, we eliminate the incentive to earn the income in the first place. We eliminate all profit. We eliminate the incentive to earn that profit in the first place. And so again, you'll have zero tax revenue. And the idea is that there's some sort of a curve there, where as you're moving from zero, you get more tax revenue as you increase tax rates. But then at some point, tax rates become so high that they slow down economic activity. And as you keep raising tax rates, tax revenue goes down. Now, the Laffer curve in those broad conceits is true. However, the problem with the Laffer curve is that there has never been any empirical evidence for the shape of the Laffer curve. Now that means that we don't know whether the peak optimal tax rate for tax revenue is 85% or 15%. We don't know. And the problem with people when they talk about the Laffer curve, and this is why I brought up that you usually hear right-wing pundits talk about the Laffer curve, is that they will then assert, well, the Laffer curve exists and tax rates are too high. We should lower tax rates and tax revenue will actually go up from all the increased economic activity. And there has never been any actual empirical evidence of the shape of the Laffer curve. We don't know if it's biased towards the upper end, biased towards the lower end, if the peak is right in the middle at 50%. And so you can get economists to agree that broadly the Laffer curve is true, but then to make any assertions based on current tax rates using the Laffer curve, you don't get a lot of agreement. It depends on what empirical data people are looking at, what they're modeling, etc. Another reason, in a positive sense, that economists disagree is that there are conflicting theories that both have empirical validity. I've experienced this in my own research and my own work. I was looking at the macroeconomic effects of corruption, and there are two broad theories when it comes to corruption and the effect on economic growth. They are the so-called grease the wheels theory and the sand in the gears theory. Now, they are exactly what they sound like. The grease the wheels theory states that the presence of corruption incentivizes governments to court bribes, to court that money that comes from corruption, which then opens up the economy to more economic activity. And there is, in my own research and other people's research, empirical evidence for this, particularly in small, underdeveloped economies, that a little bit of corruption actually brings in a lot of foreign investment, which grows the economy. On the other hand, there's the sand in the gears theory. The idea that corruption acts as an additional tax and as an interference in the free market and in the flow of investment funds, which then drives away investment. People don't want to invest in countries where they worry about the government exacting these corruption fees from them, which again is what we would call a shadow tax, an additional tax outside the formal tax system. And there is a lot of empirical evidence to support the sand in the gears theory. Now, my own work pointed to the idea that both these things are true at the same time, and it's when does one have more of a dominant effect and when does the other have more of a dominant effect? And so you can have two economists write two papers, one that says corruption is good for economic growth, another that says corruption is bad for economic growth, and they can both cite empirical evidence to the fact. Now, the reality when it comes to corruption is that there's more evidence for the sand and the gears theory when it comes to developed economies, but there's a whole lot more we'd have to unpack there and a bunch of statistical stuff that we haven't talked about. Maybe somewhere down the line in a couple of years, we'll cover enough content where I can really get into the nuts and bolts of that. But for the time being, understand that those are conflicting theories that both have empirical support and are both true in certain circumstances. So you're not going to necessarily find uniform agreement amongst economists that corruption is good or corruption is bad. And the third reason that we get positive disagreement in economics is that when we build economic models, what we generate our hypothesis testing from and what we use as evidence for a theory, depending on the assumptions we use in that model, the outcome of that model can be very different. For example, there's a thing called Ricardian equivalence. Ricardian equivalence is the idea that if tax rates go down, people save more because they anticipate a higher tax rate in the future to pay for the deficit created by the tax decrease. And when you build models about economic behavior and changes in tax policy, depending on whether or not you assume Ricardian equivalence holds, massively changes whether that tax cut stimulates the economy or not. So again, we disagree for objective reasons based on the scientific structure of economics. Economists don't just disagree for positive reasons, we also disagree for normative reasons. Remember, normative means that there is a value judgment there, a subjective aspect. So let's go back to the idea of taxation. When we're talking about what is an ideal tax, there are two broad philosophical schools of thought. There's the idea of taxes being numerically fair versus the idea of taxes being ability-driven. And so when we talk about numerical fairness, that's where you get people who argue for flat taxes. Well, everyone should pay 25% of their income as income tax. That's fair. It's the same number for everybody. But then on the other side of the fence, you've got the argument for the ability to pay. The reality is that taking 25% of someone's income that doesn't have a lot of income has a substantial effect on their quality of life. We talked about this in an earlier video when we talked about that a dollar is worth more to a poor person than a rich person. You give $10,000 to somebody who makes $30,000 a year, big change in their quality of life. You give $10,000 to someone that makes $30 million a year, no real change in their life. And that applies out through taxes. You take a third of the income of somebody who makes $30,000 a year, and what you've got is somebody who's got $20,000 a year left after taxes. That's less than $2,000 a month for rent, bills, car insurance, health insurance, food, clothing, gasoline, and that's just the basic necessities. That's before we get into anything that would actually improve quality of life. You take $10 million from someone that makes $30 million a year, they've still got $20 million. That's still a substantial amount of money to provide them with a substantial quality of life. So the argument on the other side is that those that earn more have a greater ability to pay their taxes and suffer less overall utility loss than those that earn far less. And so tax rates should be progressive. They should increase with income. Now, economically, as I did there, we made a utilitarian argument for it. But this is fundamentally a moral argument. We're talking about the definition of fairness. And what's fair is not the same thing to everybody. Everybody has their own opinion on fairness. And so you get economists that disagree on optimal tax policy because they have fundamentally different views about what is a fair tax policy. On the other side of tax policy, there's also another argument. There is the idea that earning more money is an incentive to do better, to become more productive. And so when we're talking about tax policy, there's the idea of, well, what is fair? Is fairness equality, everyone paying the same tax rate? Or is fairness less taxes for those that generate more value because they're being rewarded for generating more productivity, and we want to incentivize productivity? Again, these are rooted in philosophy. They're rooted in ethics. They're rooted in subjective ideas. And so economists, being human beings, have different subjective opinions on this. They disagree for normative reasons. Now, when we see these things, there is a popular tendency, as I said before, to say that economists never agree. But the reality is that economics is a science. You're going to find a bunch of people doing a bunch of scientific research. They're going to come to differing conclusions. And what actually matters is consensus in any field. You won't find in any field where all physicists agree, where all chemists agree, where all biologists agree. You won't find that. So what do we look for in any field of science when we are trying to understand what is true, or at least what is likely to be true? We look for consensus. So what I want to show you guys is a famous piece of economic literature. It's Gregory Mankiw's Survey of Economists that shows up in his microeconomics textbook. It's the most widely used textbook in microeconomics, so a lot of people when they go to college get exposed to this. Now, this survey data is older. It's not like this was conducted in the last few years, but it will give you a general idea of what economists agree about and what we disagree about. And we're going to start with the things where there is the greatest amount of consensus amongst economists. 93% of economists agree that rent controls, that is, price ceilings on rent, reduce the quantity and quality of available housing. Now, in our next couple of videos, when we start talking about supply and demand, we will illustrate why this is in greater detail. But the reality is, in simple economic modeling, anytime you put a price ceiling, that is a maximum price, below the market price for something, you create a shortage. This is very easy to model. This has been shown for hundreds of years, and it is something that, again, 93% of economists agree on. That's about as much consensus as economists will give you, is around 93%. Another 93% of economists will agree that tariffs and import quotas reduce the general welfare in an economy. Now, at some point we'll get to macroeconomics and we'll talk about why that is. But again, if you're going to look for what is something that's almost universally agreed upon by economists, it's that tariffs are bad. Usually, if someone is telling you that tariffs are good, one of two things are true. Either they work in a domestic industry that is less efficient than foreign competitors, and they're trying to get protection from foreign competition for themselves at a cost to society as a whole, or number two, they're what we would call a mercantilist. And mercantilism is an outdated theory of economics that died in the 1700s, although some famous politicians in the United States still subscribe to this idea. 9 out of 10 economists agree that flexible and floating exchange rates are an effective system for international monetary arrangements. That is to say that the government should not be trying to control the value of their currency relative to other currencies. Another 90% of economists would agree that fiscal policy, that is taxing and spending, is an effective way to deal with an economy that is underproducing. In other words, when we have a recession, cutting taxes and increasing government spending can stimulate economic growth to bring GDP back up to its long-term growth trend. 9 out of 10 economists agree. We should not do anything to stop the outsourcing of labor and jobs to foreign countries. That overall, macroeconomic performance improves and global economic efficiency grows. And as a result, since we live in a globalized economic system, overall economic welfare increases when we allow for the outsourcing of jobs. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons, but simply put, it's down to efficiency. We should be producing things in the most efficient manner, the lowest amount of inputs for an output, the lowest cost for a unit of output. And that means locating production where you can most efficiently produce that good or service. 88% of economists agree that economic growth in developed nations like the United States leads to increased levels of well-being within the members of that society and that economy. One of my personal favorites, 85% of economists agree that the United States should eliminate agricultural subsidies. And believe me, you give me enough time, I will go on for at least 30 minutes to an hour about the problems caused by agricultural subsidies in the United States, particularly subsidies for corn farming in the United States. And we'll save that for another video where I can properly rant about all the problems that are caused by agricultural subsidies. Suffice it to say, I'm in that 85% of economists that would argue we need to eliminate those subsidies. 85% of economists agree that appropriately designed fiscal policy, that's appropriately designed taxing and spending policy, can increase capital formation, can increase the amount of capital we accumulate. And remember, capital accumulation is one of the ways we get economic growth. Now, why is there 15% disagreement there? Well, some people might argue that fiscal policy has no real effect on capital formation, but most of that disagreement comes from the idea that when we talk about these things, there's so many limitations on how fiscal policy can affect capital formation that there's a whole lot of economists that wouldn't agree to that statement outright. They might agree to it with specific caveats, but they're not going to agree to that statement as a blanket statement. 85% of economists agree that state and local governments should eliminate subsidies to sports franchises. And believe me, this is another one of those areas where you give me the time, I can go on a nice long rant about all the problems we have from paying for stadiums. Just so you know, no government-funded stadium, no time the state, the locality has given money to a sports team to build a stadium has ever paid back the local government. It always results in losses to local government. There's been no empirical work that shows that there's any support that these stadiums actually repay the government for the amount of tax revenue that's lost and for the amount that's spent on subsidies. Once again, I'm in that 85% of economists. I don't think we should be doing this. And maybe in a later video, we'll talk about all the reasons why. And again, we can find 85% consensus with the idea that if we're going to balance the government budget, it should be done relative to the business cycle. That is, that we shouldn't force a balanced budget year after year after year after year, that we should consider where we are in the business cycle. Now, the business cycle is a lecture for another video, but in general, the business cycle is the trend of GDP growth over time. There are expansionary and contractionary phases. There are expansions and recessions as an economy grows over time. And in recessions, sometimes, a lot of the time, we need to borrow money to spend to get out of that recession. We need to cut taxes and increase government spending. Like we said before, big consensus on the idea that fiscal policy can stimulate you out of a recession. Now, when we go below the 85% threshold, there's still a lot of stuff where at least 3/4 of economists agree. So, in a little bit quicker pace, let's knock these things out. Let's talk about what most economists, or the large majority of economists, agree about. 85% of economists agree that without major changes to the structure of Social Security, the United States Social Security system will become untenable and unfunded within 50 years. Now, keep in mind, this survey was done a while ago. That clock has ticked down. It's more like 30 years now. We are headed for a massive cliff with Social Security, according to, again, around 85% of economists. 84% of economists will agree that cash payments are a better system for welfare than payment in kind. In other words, all of these crazy welfare schemes we have in the United States where there's food stamps, but you've got to work or volunteer for X hours a month, and you can only spend it on these things and not other things. The reality is, that's usually based on normative beliefs and not economic logic. It's a lot more economically efficient to just give people a set amount of cash and they make that a subsidy to their income. 83% of economists will tell you that a large federal deficit, like the massive multi-trillion-dollar deficits, the unprecedentedly large deficits we are running right now, are bad for long-run economic growth. 83% of economists agree that one of the roles for the government of the United States is the redistribution of wealth. Now, again, is that as much as some of the other theories that were around 93%? No, but again, little more than 4 out of 5 economists agree that an appropriate use of the government is the redistribution of wealth and income. While on the subject of that one, you see the problem with learning your economics from the news. The news, at best, presents this idea that everything is 50-50, that there's a liberal view and a conservative view, and they're equally valid. You listen to Fox News, and they will tell you that it's 85% of economists disagree that, well, actually, they probably tell you 100% of economists disagree that wealth redistribution is an appropriate role for government, even though the vast majority of economists would agree that wealth redistribution is an appropriate use of the government. Again, it's why I'm here for y'all. It's what I'm trying to do. I want you to understand the scientific realities of these things rather than the normative opinions that you see on television. 83% of economists will tell you that inflation is caused by too much growth in the money supply. Now, again, when we talk about inflation, particularly what's going on right now, there's a lot to dig into. But overall and across global economies, most of the time, people agree with Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said that inflation is always and everywhere a result of growth of the money supply. 82% of economists agree that the United States should not ban GMOs, should not ban genetically modified crops. Now, again, this is not a comment on biology or human digestive systems or anything else like that, but purely from an economic standpoint, a large amount of economists agree that there is value in genetically modified organisms. And something that we will talk about at a later point, 79% of economists agree that increasing the minimum wage will increase unemployment for the unskilled and particularly for young people who traditionally don't have a lot of skills. 79% of economists, count me among them, agree that the welfare system should be redesigned into what we call a negative tax system. Basically, you pick a point of minimum income, and everybody that earns above that income pays taxes, and everybody that earns below that income gets a rebate from the government to raise their income up to that minimum level. 78%, little more than 3/4 of all economists agree that putting taxes on effluence and creating a market system for pollution rights, what we call cap and trade programs, are a more efficient system to deal with pollution than just putting pollution ceilings in place. And finally, again, I'm in the majority here, 78% of economists agree that the United States should reduce or eliminate subsidies on ethanol. Goes back to the idea of subsidies on corn being a problem. I hope this has been enlightening. I hope that seeing where strong majority consensus exists among economists has opened your eyes to the more empirical realities of these issues that are commonly presented as equally valued, left versus right, when in reality, some of these things are on the political left. Negative taxation, cash welfare as opposed to the payments in kind. And some of these subsidies are on the right in terms of minimum wage causing unemployment problems and outsourcing generally being good for overall economic efficiency. And that is what I really want to get across to y'all. I hope that you'll, as we go through this, you'll learn and come to understand that how we view these things scientifically is not at all related to the biased political debates where you typically see economics presented. And hopefully, as we keep doing this, you'll all learn and understand why that consensus is there. Whether you come to agree with it or not is a different story, but hopefully you can see those arguments and why they have validity. Because again, what matters is the truth. What matters is what we can objectively, what we can positively show, and then we make policy decisions based on where the consensus of knowledge is, rather than on someone's normative opinions. All right, y'all, that'll do it for this week. Like always, I've been Dr. Brooks Mullen. This was Blue Collar Economics, and I'll see y'all next time.